I'm Kevin Kenny. I'm director of Glasgow Ireland House. We're thrilled to see a full house on this side of the house this evening. This is actually our third public event. We're just getting up and running this month after our 2.5-year ordeal. So welcome everybody. This time next week we'll have Dan Mulhall, the outgoing ambassador to the United States, who's from Ireland, obviously, who's teaching with us this semester, and he'll be lecturing next week. So if you're around in town, please come to that as well. This evening, it's my great pleasure to introduce somebody who I think is well known to all of you in the audience, the novelist and historian Peter Quinn. And Peter, to welcome you back to Ireland House after this extraordinary period we've been through, to launch his latest book, a memoir called Cross Bronx, you see in front of you. So just a note on the format, Peter will introduce and read from his text from the podium here, and he will then be interviewed by the storyteller, Charles Hale. Welcome to Ireland House, Charles. And Peter will actually introduce Charles in his opening comments. After the interview format, we'll open things up for discussion. So I'm sure there'll be plenty of Q&A. Most of you, as I mentioned, know Peter as a central and beloved figure in Irish-American cultural circles, and here in Glasgow Ireland House throughout the 30 years of our operation. Peter insisted yesterday when we talked on the phone that I not give a lengthy introduction. So I'm going to disregard that, Peter.
I wrote one for you.
Peter has written a speech for me here, and I'll give a medium-length merited introduction to Peter. I'll skip over the details of his childhood in the Bronx, some of which may be alluded to his backstory in the memoir. Peter's, as you know, native New Yorker and a native of the Bronx, educated there. Skip to 1979 when Peter was appointed to the staff of Governor Hugh Carey as chief speechwriter, and continued in that role under Governor Mario Cuomo, helping craft the governor's 1984 Democratic Convention speech and many others. Peter then joined Time, Inc. as chief speechwriter in 1985. It was around that time that I first met Peter during my first stint here in New York when I was a graduate student. And Peter was editing a journal called The Recorder, the journal of the American Irish Historical Society at that time. Peter actually published, or allowed me to get me enough rope to play with, to publish some ill-advised reviews that I've written. Actually, my master's thesis.
Your first.
So you know, in some ways, I owe my start to Peter and his mentorship in that period. One thing that became clear when we met, and Peter was still writing speeches at timing, then was that Peter wanted to write novels, even more, or instead of entirely. And I remember Peter telling me that how he did that was he got up at 5 in the morning and he wrote for a couple of hours before taking the train into the city. So it can be done. The result of that effort was Banished Children of Eve, which came out in 1994. And most of you, I'm sure, have read it, and won, I believe, an American Book Award and other awards too. Alongside novels, Peter continued to work on history, his passion. Of course, Banished Children of Eve is a work of history. It's a historical novel. Worked for television and film, and I don't think I need to go into all of the details of Peter's accomplishments there. I'll include Gangs of New York among accomplishments. That's, we can talk about that. But many documentaries and films and television programs. Peter retired as corporate editorial director for Time Warner in 2007, which allowed him to write more or less full time. And in an extraordinary burst of creativity over the next 6 years, he published the collection of nonfiction pieces you probably know, Looking for Jimmy, In Search of Irish America, and then the renowned trilogy of historical detective novels. So this evening, we have the pleasure of launching Peter's latest book, Cross Bronx. So just to raise the bar and no pressure, Peter, I will read from the publisher's copy. Cross Bronx is, and I quote, Peter Quinn's one-of-a-kind account of his adventures as ad man, archivist, teacher, Wall Street messenger, court officer, political speechwriter, corporate scribe, and award-winning novelist. Like Pete Hamill, Quinn is a New Yorker through and through. His evolution from a childhood in a now vanished Bronx to his exploits in the halls of Albany and swish corporate offices to then walking away from it all is evocative and entertaining and enlightening from first page to last. Cross Bronx is bursting with witty, captivating stories. So to hear some of those stories, I'll welcome Peter to the
Can I use this one?
No, it's not hooked up because it interferes. The two systems interfere.
This is what happens when you write a
lot of knowledge you can't walk anymore.
Everybody pays a price, right? Oh, yeah, you know that, yeah.
Yeah, so that's not functional.
Thank you, Kevin. Very generous words. I'm happy you won't be subject to a lie detector test. It's a pleasure as well as an honor to launch Cross Bronx and Writing Life at Arlington House. For me, this is as much a home as a house. Almost 30 years ago, in March 1994, I launched Banished Children of Eve, my first book in this room. I was 8 years old. I don't think Kevin was born yet. I've read from all my subsequent books here and interviewed, among others, Dan Barry and William Kennedy. 30 years from now, when I'm 105, I plan to return with my sequel to Cross Bronx, Crossed Out. Hopefully by then the house will have a nursing home attached to it. Let me thank Charles Hale for agreeing to conduct the conversation. Charles is an accomplished director, producer, and videographer. The shows he's presented at venues like the Cell Theater and the Museum of the City of New York are as enlightening as they are entertaining. Peter Quinn's New York, the video Charles made about my Been Done Detective trilogy, was described by my publisher as, at the time, as a stunning summary. If there's someone with a deeper understanding of this city's history and culture than Charles, I haven't met him or her. Let me make two brief points about memoirs. First, all families have their secrets. But in my experience, Irish families place special emphasis on keeping theirs. We have our own code of silence, Omerta. That's spelled O''M'. It's intended to make sure what happens in an Irish family stays in the Irish family. As well as hearing from those who detected factual mistakes, I've been put on notice by those who feel I've betrayed confidences and misreported events. My advice is, as they say in the Bronx, sue me. Better yet, write your own memoir. Second, we are all entitled to our own set of opinions, Daniel Patrick Moynihan famously said. What we're not entitled to is our own set of facts. Entitled or not, we all have our own set of memories. They often don't agree. It's been said there are few things more unreliable than an eyewitness. In a memoir, we play eyewitness to our own lives. Even within the same family, with people raised in the same house, recollections can radically differ. In 1998, I traveled to Limerick with Frank and Ellen McCord. The movie version of Angela's Ashes, Frank's blockbuster memoir, was being filmed. Frank took me to the Redemptorist Church, where as a boy he heard Ernest Hemingway's books denounced as, quote, a descent into the moral sewers of sexual depravity. Frank immediately resolved to get his hands on them as soon as he could. As we stood in the vestibule, a woman eyed us warily. She didn't seem to believe what she was seeing. Are you Frank McCourt? She asked. I am, Frank replied. Your book is full of lies, she said. Name one, Frank said. She began to walk away. There were no cobblestones in Limerick, she said. Now, the question of whether Limerick streets were paved with cobblestones is best left to local historians. The larger point is that we all have our cobblestones of the heart, memories unique to us, to what we remember, or regret, or prefer to forget, what we love, what we lost, the sorrowful, joyful mysteries of our individual humanity. What follows is one of my own cobblestones. Let's go to the videotape. I don't like to read a lot of books because then people think they don't have to buy it.
That's what Franklin Ford said.
Some people, sometimes it feels like they are reading the whole book. All right. It was 1968. I was in Manhattan College in the North Bronx. I felt I was missing the upheaval shaking the globe from Paris to Prague to San Francisco. I wanted to see the world. I wanted what I couldn't put into words. My philosophy teacher that year had been raised in Florence and had a face like Dante's. He was from the rigorous wing of the academy. The course consisted of only 3 texts. Bishop Berkeley's A Treatise Concerning Human Knowledge, Baruch Spinoza's Ethics Demonstrated in Geometrical Order, and Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. Sounds pretty exciting, right? I think I read the first 2, or at least I tried. I vividly recall the cover of Kant's book, black, the title in bold red, and that's about as far as I got. We were graded on class participation and a final exam that consisted of 1 question. If he found we were parroting outside commentators, we lost 1 grade. The question concerning Kant's tome, I scored 0 in the first category and 0 in the second. I didn't lose a grade for relying on outside commentators. Failing philosophy meant I had to go to summer school. My brother Tom and I worked as doormen at the Tower East on 72nd Street and attended school at night. Kant made no more sense the second time than the first, but somehow I passed. On the last night of school and work, we attended a Richie Havens concert with friends in Central Park. For some reason I can't remember, it might have something to do with what we inhaled. We decided to share a ride out to the Hamptons. The plan, if you want to call it, was to see if we could find people we knew to crash with for the weekend. It was an era filled with high hopes and impossible dreams. We slept in the car on the side of the Long Island Expressway. The major but not only problem was that none of the car windows opened. Waking roadside on a baking July morning, I felt the imminent asphyxiation that threatened the protagonist imposed the premature burial. We parked at Hot Dog Beach, East Quad. The sand was covered blanket to blanket with the beautiful and otherwise. The smell of the sea, suntan oil, and lust filled the air. We wandered the shoreline until there seemed no reason to continue. It was my brother Tom who cited Chris and Betty, 2 girls he'd encountered a few times at a bar in the Bronx. They were extremely pretty and very welcoming. They invited us to sit with them and their friends. We made no mention of our shelter-seeking intentions. I glanced at Chris's sister standing on the far side of the blanket, then glanced again. She was willowy, with long, shimmering, auburn hair that framed a beautiful face. I felt something stir inside me I'd never felt before, something beyond physical attraction. Now, I don't know if there's a force in the universe called fate, that even if we're unaware, even if we resist, we can't avoid. Luck is a lighter word, which we all recognize as part of our lives, whether good or bad. Maybe if I'd paid attention I know if Kant offers insights into the existence or non-existence of fate. An acquaintance with a doctorate in philosophy assures me he does. I'm too old at this point to care. In the course of novel writing, I frequently draw on characters, events, and places from my life. Dressed in the motley of fiction, they allow me to describe what otherwise I'd have to guess. I think it was Tolstoy who said true arrogance is quoting oneself. I'm fairly sure it wasn't Yogi Berra. If I could avoid it, I would, but there's a passage in Banished Children of Eve in which I put into the protagonist's head what I felt at that moment on Hot Dog Beach. Quote, he was unsure of what to do next, unsure in a manner difficult to explain. It was as if the weather had suddenly changed, although it hadn't, or as if the air itself was somehow different than before, although it wasn't. And he kept feeling like that, unsure, even when he went his way and stayed that way all day and the next. I don't believe there's one person with whom we're meant to find true love. Love is part chance and part choice. It's reserved for no particular duo. Yet there's only one person who, no matter how content or happy we are with somebody else, was destined to think about from time to time, wonder where they are at this moment, if they're happy with the life they found, what would have happened if things had been different. What began on Hot Dog Beach led to a long, tumultuous, on and off 14-year courtship that would reach its denouement until a far distant evening in Albany, when I missed the last train to the city, wandered into a bar not far from the Capitol, and spotted the girl from Hot Dog Beach by the door with a friend. Fate doesn't follow calendars or clocks. Love's not time's fool. Thank you. Just take this. Thank you. You asked tough questions, Charles. I hit you with it. Yeah.
I always promised myself I would never speak after Peter, always before. So here we go. Anyway, I was really honored that Peter asked me to conduct this interview tonight. And frankly, I was a little surprised given some of his friends. He mentioned Dan Barry and William Kennedy. So I asked his wife, Kathy, how he ended up choosing me. And she said, well, the fact of the matter is he had 9 people turn him down. And I said to Peter, why don't you ask Charles? And Peter said, great idea. He's got no pride. He'll do it. So here I am.
I paid you too, so.
So actually, Peter and I first met here at our own house, probably, I don't know how many years, 10, 12, 14 years ago, when Peter was moderating a panel of Irish writers. And when it was over, I went up to him and said, Peter, I'd like to get a little more involved in the Irish community. What do I need to do? And he said, well, normally we meet in a pub after this. And I thought, what a novel idea. Irish writers meeting in a pub after an event. And it's funny because early in your book, you talk about Alice McDermott's Charming Billy, and the opening scene occurs in a bar.
Across from St. Raymond's.
Across from St. Raymond's post-funeral.
Right.
So what is it about Irish pubs and bars?
Well, if you have to ask that, you shouldn't be moderating.
Come on, give me a break.
Seriously, one thing about Irish bars were never just bars. They were, from the beginning, they were hiring halls, most of the political bosses in New York, Murphy, Croker, they all owned saloons. But a saloon was like, it was, if you look at the old pictures of saloons and bars, they were kind of luxurious places. People lived in these little small apartments. They went out, these places were light and beautiful, and it was about much more than drinking. You know, and it was about much more than talking, because talking with a purpose, forming unions. And, you know, Tammany Hall, you connected with people who helped you find the job for your daughter or your son. It was like the bar was a secular version of the church. It even had, the bar was a little like the altar, right? And the bartender wore vestments. So it had very practical purpose. It wasn't just, you know, people did not just go to get drunk at bars. They went to do a lot of things. And again, one of the things was to get out of the apartments that they lived in, which was stifling and small. And it was a little glamour there, like a church.
All right, so let's go
And
back.
there's one other thing, I love this line from The Quiet Man, where Barry Fitzgerald says, "We're gonna go to the pub and talk sedition." That was an Irish tradition. You felt safe in a bar, but the informers weren't usually there.
So why don't I go back to the beginning of New York City? Peter's family and my family arrived really about the exact same time.
Famine Irish.
Famine Irish in the 1840s and 50s. And they were on the Bowery. My family's first residence was 25 Bowery. So it was the Bowery and the surrounding neighborhood. And your father was born on 7th Street, above 11th Street,
11th Street,
above
yeah.
a pub.
Right.
And your family lived on 7th Street.
Yeah, my great grandparents died on 7th Street.
We share a name. We have an
1912.
ancestral name. We
Yeah.
share Manning, so we may be related.
Well, there's another story. We're going to talk about Irish families and secrets I was talking about. When Looking for Jimmy came out, I got a letter out of the blue from a woman. Because I talked a little about my family, the Mannings. We were related. She was a long lost cousin. And she's a genealogist. And she said, well, actually the name wasn't Manning. It was Mannion. And your grandfather's name, your great-grandfather wasn't Michael Manning, he was Mihal Mannion. And I mean, and my grandmother, who was Margaret Manning, was baptized Margaret Mannion. And we don't know why they, I think maybe because it was too Irish sounding. But it was like, you know, talking about discovering things when you look at your family. Well, that wasn't the name.
So you talk about family secrets. And I don't have any family secrets
Just,
until I started researching. And I'm going to give you a little story.
he's a great researcher for you know,
All this kind of stuff. You just, you know how it is. You get right down the rabbit hole. You get a little something and you keep going and going. So I was doing some ancestral research and I learned that a great-great-grandfather of mine, his name was Pierce Keating. And I found his death certificate. And it sounded like, from what I was reading, he died in a fire in Brooklyn in 1884. So I decided I should look in the newspapers, go to the Brooklyn Library and look in the newspapers. Well, I didn't even have to do that because now everything is digitized. So I go online for the Brooklyn Library and I type in the name Pierce Keating and I find the story of the fire. It's on the front page of one of the Brooklyn newspapers. And that really surprised me, but the reason it was on the front page is the firefighters couldn't get the ladders up to the top window. And he ended up dying. His son was seriously injured. But as a result, they decided we have to start taking the cable lines and putting them underground. So it was an interesting fact that my family was somehow involved in that. But that's not what really caught my attention. It was the following two stories. I actually have them here. And one is, so I type in Pierce Keating, a disorderly house raided, 4 women and 2 men whose morals need reforming. That's the headline. And I'm saying, what the heck is this? So I'm not going to go into the sordid details, but it's not good. And the following year, now this is Pierce Keating Jr. This was Pierce who died. This is his son. And there's another one that says, Keating caged again, a well-known character charged with beating his sister. And I read through it, and the judge, it's like reading prose. The judges, I thought we got rid of you last year. Weren't you here for hitting your other sister with a frying pan? And so, what are you talking about, family secrets? I have no family secrets. But, you know, it seems to me that the Irish, it's like some form of cultural amnesia,
well,
better known as
yeah.
mind your own business.
Well, I also think it's immigrant culture that, and part of it is well intentioned that they didn't want to give stories of failure and success and people hitting their mothers with fire pans. They wanted to fit into, you know, respectability is not a dirty word, especially for immigrants. They wanted to come up the ladder. And a lot of families, like my family, I was told my great grandmother had 10 children. No, 5. She had 10. 5 died before adulthood. 2 died as little girls. Anastasia and Catherine. And they're buried in Calvary Cemetery without any of them. I never knew this till this woman gave me all this research. And my mother, that was my father's family. My mother's family was no slouch. My mother used to say, if they were lost relatives, they were lost for a reason. I had an uncle, William Brady, who died of a heart attack the day before they were going to Florida in January 1930. It turns out that he was involved with bootleggers in Hackensack and was murdered in front of my aunt and 2 children. It's a front page story in the Bergen Record. William Brady, they say he's a gangster. He wasn't a gangster. He was shot 13 times, and he died in her arms. And the man who murdered him was Willie Moretti, who's the guy on The Godfather who puts the head in the bed. He was the Godfather for Frank Sinatra. And I don't know any of this. When I turn 18, I go to get my birth certificate so I can go to the draft office and get my draft card so I can drink legally. And I'd open these files that my father had way up, and I looked, and I'm reading this. I said, what did he, he was a lawyer. Did he keep this as one of his first cases? Then I began to see the names, Marguerite, his wife, Billy, and Jane, his daughter. I realized this is my uncle William, who died of a heart attack. So I told my sister, she said, don't bring it up. My father was, the last thing they wanted when my father was in politics was to have a brother-in-law who was murdered by the mob. It was not like the Irish, the Irish politicians didn't mix with the mob. That was the kind of thing. So there are still secrets I don't know. I'm sure that they took with them to the grave. But again, I think, it's not, I don't know about other families, but I know it's kind of religion with Irish families to keep that stuff out of the, my mother was like, she was a classic lace curtain Irish woman. She was educated. I used to think that, well, that's not a good thing. But then I realized the way she was raised was that it was an ambition. They wanted to get away from all that stuff, the gangsters and the dirt and the journey over and the people, the babies they buried. They wanted a middle class life, which is not. There was an Irish writer who said the Irish curse is not drink, it's respectability. I don't feel that way. I think distinct desire for respectability is a curse. I'm pretty respectable, right? I'm wearing clean socks.
I want to go back to your reading about Hot Dog Beach, the hot girl from Hot Dog Beach. So I looked today, I went and looked through the book, and it was interesting because I had read it a while ago. And I remember he used Hot Dog Beach, and I said, well, let me see how many times Peter says the girl from Hot Dog Beach before he actually mentions her name. And it's 6 times, and he doesn't mention her name until page 106. So the bottom line is, I think Kathy said to you when you were writing this book, don't put me in that sort of mess. Don't talk about me.
She's in the 3rd row.
Oh, I'm sorry, Kathy. Not many people, I'm certainly one, have a friendship with someone who's won a Pulitzer Prize. And you have 3.
Right.
Frank McCourt, William Kennedy, and Dan Barry.
Yeah.
An inspiration, intimidation?
Depressing.
Very good.
Where was I? No, it's, the thing about it, none of them ever had pretentious in the slightest bit. And they all came, Dan from Long Island, and he St. Bonaventure's. None of them went to famous writing programs. They all learned, well, Bill Kennedy was a journalist in Albany. His wife was Puerto Rican. They moved to Puerto Rico. None of them expected success. They all came. And Frank McCourt, I remember we used to have this thing. Mary used to be the first Friday lunches. And Frank was retiring as a school teacher. I said, what are you going to do? He said, I'm going to write a memoir about growing up poor in Limerick. I said to myself, good luck. Who's going to read it except your mother? And she's dead. So he didn't have, none of them went to Ivy League schools. They had no pretensions. They were from working class families. And William Kennedy, when he wrote, it was his 4th novel, Ironweed. He sent it to 13 publishers, and they all rejected it. They said it's depressing. So one of his assignments when he was in Puerto Rico, he did a interview with Saul Bellow. And he said to Bellow, I have this manuscript. And Bellow was generous enough to read it. And he was at Viking, Bellow. And he called his editor and said, if you don't publish this book, I'm leaving Viking. So the book that's depressing is published, wins the Pulitzer, the National Book Award, he gets the MacArthur Award, and now he started the Writers Institute in Albany. And then he's a genius. And he laughs about it. He says, one day I'm an idiot. And then they decide I'm a genius. So, you know, he said, and he once told me, he gave me, I have the interview that I did with him in the back of
Which
the
is
book.
brilliant. The last 10 pages of the book or the interview, it's brilliant.
He told me more in that, it was an afternoon, I spent my last day in Albany, I went out to his house. And he told me all this, he said, you know, writing is a matter of renewing your vulnerability. If you write, you put it out there, somebody's gonna stomp on it. And if you can't stop, if you can't take the stomping, don't bother. He also said writers are people are right. If you don't, if you get rejected 5 times and you stop writing, you're not a writer. It's not who you are. You just go on and you don't worry about the result, you worry about the writing. And I mean, it took me 10 years to write Banished Children, and that was always in the back of my head. You know, writers are people who write. You don't want to do it, don't do it. But if you're going to do it, you get up. I had a rigid schedule, 5 days a week, get up at 5:30, work for 2 hours, and then turn to my day job. And I was a fanatic about it. Kathy used to say to me, you know, you got a cold, it's cold out. I said, if I miss one day, I'll never go back. And I just plowed through. And, you know, it's like the whole idea of the romanticism of writing. Who thought of that? When I was at Time Inc., people used to say, you know, when I retire, I'm going to do what you do. You know, go up to the attic, sit by yourself, and drive a nail into your head. And then pull it out and start again the next day. And, you know, so I didn't even have an agent, but I had, I guess some people have this, I felt like if I was on my deathbed and I hadn't written this book, I'd be struggling for air. And then if I wrote this, it would make a difference, and it did, made all the difference.
Just going back to the another thought about the hot dog beach. Can't get it out of my mind. How difficult is it to write about someone you're so close to?
Depends on who it is. It's hard. It's not writing about any person. That was always in the back of my head, you know. De mortuis nil nisi bonum, the Latin thing, don't never, about the dead only say good. I mean, I had a difficult relationship with my father. I try to be fair about it. I didn't avoid it. I think I only have one totally villainous person in the book. I think, you know, if you're a novelist, you understand how complex everybody is, and that everybody, what's that famous line from the movie? Everybody has their own reason, and that's the problem. So I learned from writing novels about being sympathetic. I never wrote a total villain. So, you know, I don't know if there are. If you get to know them, and a novelist is like you're inside somebody all the time. Now, the First Bronx could have been 600 pages, but I left a lot out.
So you have a rare perspective on governors. You worked for 2, you, Carey, and Mario Cuomo. What was the big difference?
Oh, well, they were very different. One was Irish, one was Italian. There's a cultural difference there. And they had a lot, you know, they were both out-of-borough ethnic Catholics, which I was. And they were both kind of schooled in, you know, the practical nature of democratic politics and New Deal governments should make people's lives a little better. Carey had no ideology. He would just get it done. You knew if there was a commissioner outside his office, that was because they weren't doing a job. Otherwise, he didn't want to see them. And he could make, he landed in Europe 3 days after D-Day and went all the way to the Remagen Bridge. He became like a captain. He saw a lot of people die, and he realized, he once said to me, only 2 choices will make your decision. You're right or you're wrong, but you have to make it. Cuomo was, Carey, they didn't get along. They hated each other. Carey called Cuomo cacklehead behind his back. And they tried their best in public, but it was like de Blasio and Andrew Cuomo. He once said, you know, Cuomo missed his calling. He should have been a sociology professor at a junior college. He didn't say that in public, and I never said it. So, but they used to take the plane to Albany. We'd all be on the plane, and I used to sit in the back because I didn't want to be near the governor and have speeches to rewrite. And Cuomo sat in the back, so we became very friendly. And he was an amazingly interesting guy to talk to. He could be very theoretical and deliberate. I always said if he was governor during the fiscal crisis, it would still be going on. He got this reputation as Hamlet on the Hudson. And it was partly deserved, I think. He just overthought things sometimes. So they were very, very, very different. Terry would get it done. Cuomo would talk to you for hours to discuss speeches.
And you, Carrie, sang at your wedding.
He did. I became really good friends with him. He was a really interesting guy. And when I met Mario Cuomo, when I first met him, I thought, this is the most transparently knowable person I've ever met. So easy to know him. And by the time I worked for him, at the end of it, I said, this is the most opaque, unknowable person. Is he telling me this? So I'll tell Jim, who'll tell John, who'll tell Jane, and he'll get back to. He thought like that. The thing is, they were both, I was very lucky. I'm writing for two governors from the same background as I, both with this Catholic, Labor, or Democratic background. So I didn't have to, when they made references, I remember once Terry told me, I was talking about Thomas More and they thought I was talking about the poet. I wasn't talking about the saint. Well, I would know that. I wouldn't have to be explained to me what it was about. It was culturally very. So, it was a great, again, if you're a novelist, I know people become writers and they sit in rooms and write. I was very grateful for the experiences I had, seeing how we're up close, how people react. It was like the merges.
The interesting thing with Cuomo, he's find him a fascinating figure. And probably what he may most be remembered for are his speeches.
And not running for president.
And we'll throw it in. And you were involved in two of them. One was the '84 Democratic Convention and the other his speech at Notre Dame.
Right.
And many people consider that, in fact, Dan Barry comments that speech in 1984 as one of the great political speeches. Let's hear about it.
Well, the myth was he wrote it 5 hours in the mansion, but nobody writes speeches like that in 5 hours. I did a draft. I sent it to him. He redid it. I tell the whole story in the book. We went back and forth for a week, revising, and then we finally thought we had a version. And I was with Andrew and Mike Del Judas and Tim Russet, Forrest, and they looked at the speech. They said, this is pretty good. So we went to the newsroom where they used to have the news conferences, and we turned out the lights, and they voted people from the mail room and normal working class people. And he turned the lights off and gave the speech. And we waited. They said, well, it pretty much sucks. So we went back to Cuomo's office in a huff. And I had read the section where he talks directly to Reagan, Mr. President. And Tim Russet said, put that at the front. And we did it and it made a big difference. And then we rewrote it again. Then we came back, turned out the lights, put another crowd of people in. They said, oh, it's great, except the ending is terrible. So Andrew pulled me aside. He said, you got to fix the ending. So I got Cuomo's diaries, and I found this anecdote about his father bleeding from his feet. He works a lot, and I used that for the ending. Then we went back the last time, and they really liked it. And that's the speech he gave.
That was a great speech. It really was.
And Notre Dame was a whole nother story. That was very accidental. That he gave a speech at St. John the Divine the Sunday after Easter. It was the only speech Kathy and I ever went to hear him give. Just hear him, and he gave it word for word, and I figured that's it. I didn't know Maureen Dowd was in the audience, and she wrote a story that was on the front page of the Times the next day. And now he's the first president to talk about his religion. I said in depth. So he gets an invitation from Richard McBrien, the head of the theology department, to come out and give a talk. So he decides to give a talk, and then it turns out to be the presidential election, in which abortion is a big issue for the first time with Reagan. So he's giving a speech on abortion in Notre Dame. He was going to do a little speech, and it was nationally broadcast. And it was another thing. I worked on it with a friend of mine, Bill Hamill, who studied to be a Jesuit for 11 years. And he was one of the best writers I ever met. He had stainless steel mind and editor, and we did it together.
Did you enjoy speech writing?
No.
Okay, it's pretty good for someone who doesn't like
provided a good living. I enjoy what it taught me. The idea that you wait for the muse to come. Writing is work. That's what I learned from Mario Cuomo said it's ass power.
Yeah.
You sit and then you have to meld thoughts together. And if you're writing a speech, You get a lot of information from other people, and you have to put it into something that's interesting, that's going to keep people's. And I always found it hard. I did it for 30 years. I can't say I ever found it easy speech, and I was generally unable to recycle things. It wasn't worth it.
But you did it for politicians and CEOs.
5 CEOs.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
was there a big difference in what you were doing?
Well, yeah, I mean, the one difference was a political speechwriter is like the next day is right in your face, and they're going to look in the paper to see what was said. The B section of the Times used to be dedicated to local politics and state politics, and that was sports pages. I read them, and the speeches would be there. That was not that was not true. It was much slower. I mean, it had its pressures, but it wasn't. Political speech writing is for young people. It really, you know, it's a cliche about burnout, but if you don't get burned out doing that, it'd be Friday afternoon, you say, well, the week is over, I'm going home, and the phone would ring. I said, oh, the governor had a speech on Sunday to this, and you could never say, yeah, I'm not doing it or something, which was a great thing. I mean, it was another lesson about writing. There were no excuses. You could never say, I need another week, I need another day. You had it, or if you didn't, and if you didn't, you were gone, and don't feel bad about it. I always, Franklin, who was the Times bureau chief for a while in Albany, when I first got up there, he said, you know, I said, I really feel close to politician, and he said, don't. He said, don't take it personally, but you are useful, and once you start being useful, you're done. And it's not anything to do with you, it's just with the job. They have to have people around them. Politicians are not in the business to make friends. The things to get things done and get reelected. If they don't do that, because I had friends that Cuomo was a seducer, unbelievable seducer of people. You thought you were his best friend, and you know this was great. And then you'd be out, and I knew guys years later. Well, I thought he was my friend. No, they're not. It's not. It's not. It just goes back. I mean, the Renaissance paper. It goes back to the Caesar. Goes back to we climbed out of trees. That, you know, which politics and corporate. It's about power.
Yeah. Let's change the subject and talk about your father. You basically alluded to you had a difficult relationship, and you talk about it in the book. And I remember, I don't know how many years ago it was, 4 or 5 years ago, you had written an article and you sent it to me and you said, I'm going to have this published. Tell me what you think. I'm just going to read the opening of it. It's very short. I reached for my father's hand as he lay in his hospital bed, sensing his unease. I quickly let go. It was my last attempt at intimacy. He died several days later, maintaining the distance between us to the end. I read that and my mouth was open, agape, because I had just made a short film about my father. And in that, this is what I said. Soon it was time to leave. I walked over to his bed and touched his arm. I could see the tears welling in his eyes. We didn't speak. We just smiled through the tears and shook our heads at each other. Gestures that said what we couldn't. A month after his operation, my mother found him lying in his garden. My father never came to terms with all the obstacles that he'd wrestled with over and over. So what is it about Irish fathers and sons? Is it an Irish thing? Is it a father and son thing?
It's a picture of Irish literature. Playboy of the Western World, Philadelphia, Here I Come, Long Day's Journey into Night. I mean, you know, it's always father-son conflict. There's another, you know, it's like Jewish mother, Irish father. Don't let them marry. Yeah, well, it was built into the Irish agricultural system. Of the oldest son would get the farm, and everybody else would have to leave, and there was all that tension. You know, I think it was partly economically driven, partly cultural. And I can't speak about other families, but I know that was part of my upbringing. And I know a lot of fellow Irish Americans who had the same difficulties with their fathers. And there was that, you know, it was part of Irish culture too, post-famine Irish culture of the emotional remoteness.
Mm.
Which wasn't true with Irish mothers, I don't think. My brother wrote a long article for the Daily News about Irish mothers and their sons. So we were the first one to tackle that topic with Irish mothers. And, you know, I try to say in the book, my father had a public personality and a private personality. And, you know, I respect him, I love him, but it was not a happy experience. He had expectations, and you know, he would direct everything as everything was to be done as he said. And of course, the pathetic thing is you try not to make any of your father's mistakes, so you make a new set of mistakes. I have a son, and he said when he grew up, he said, you know, you didn't know how to say no. I don't know what would have happened if it wasn't for mom. She's the one who. Because I had so much discipline as a kid, from the Christian brothers to the, you know, local police to my parents. I didn't have any stomach for it. Didn't.
Well, my son wanted to be here. Peter knows my son. He couldn't make it. And I remember, talk about relationships with your children. My son and I get along very well, but we had our moments. And I remember once Chris said to me, Dad, you're crazy. And I said, Chris, you have to understand that fathers are put on earth to drive their sons fucking batshit nuts. Once you get that, everything will be great. So anyway, but that's, all right, let's move on to New York City. Something else.
Oh, yeah.
I don't want to sit here and start crying. And we all know the special relationship you have with New York and your books and your videos, and you have a special place in Rick Burns, New York, which is so fabulous. And so Peter and I created a little video a few years back, as he mentioned, to promote his book. And what actually happened is we had finished it and we were sitting in the kitchen having a cup of coffee or something. And Peter made a comment and I said, wait a minute, can you remember exactly what you just said? We're going back and we're changing the ending of the film. And here's what he said at that point, and this is the ending of the film. Having been raised in New York, I feel I received an enormous gift. People travel all over the world to write in exotic places. But when you grow up here in the boroughs, it's like living in different worlds. The older I get, the more I'm struck by the drama of change that goes on around us. It's a great gift for a novelist. You don't have to search for drama in New York, you just live it. New York is a gift. I love that.
That's how I've always felt. I only left New York once. I was a Vista volunteer in Kansas City in 1970. I remember leaving at that time. A lot of people were banning the city. Didn't want to go to California. You know, it was like we grew up on Clancy Brothers, beer, and Catholic schoolgirls, and we thought, you know, California was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And a lot of people were coming west. They'd stop at Kansas to see me. And it was at that point I was thinking of going with my roommate to become a teacher in California. And I looked, first time I ever looked back and saw New York in the distance and said, you know, I don't really, first of all, I don't really know anything about my family, but that's who I am. That's not, I don't care if the whole thing blows up, I'm going to be in it when it blows up because it's just who I am. And it streets, the smells, the people.
Do you, you often, you write history and we don't know exactly what happened in history. And I always say I use my imagining to come up with a story. Do you think about that a lot still? Imagine, go back, and what was it like?
Well, you know, when I was started, I originally was going to write a story. I wanted to write a history about the famine immigration to New York. I realized my family were part of it, and I'm thinking about this, and I realized, well, they're just names on baptismal certificate. I don't know anything about them. And if I'm an honest historian like Kevin, I can't put words in their mouth. I can't fill in their backgrounds. I can't really say, well, this is why they got married. This was like on that day. And I had never written fiction. And I was like jumping off a cliff to say, well, you know, I want to write novels that are true to the facts as the facts are known. But 99% of what happened in human history is not on the record. Tonight's not going to be on the record. How you feel tonight about other people or what's going on, or let's say there's a war over the Ukraine nuclear bomb. We're going to be mass statistics. History's mass statistics. And I wanted the humanity under that. And the only way you can get to that is in a novel. You know, I said, novels are, what did Randall Jennings say? Lies in pursuit of the truth. Novel is a big lie. Everybody says, well, you learned that in speech writing, right? No, I didn't learn that in speech writing, but and it's liberating at the same time. One of the characters who drove Banished Children was Stephen Foster, the songwriter. And I found that he was in New York in the 1860s in the draft riots. And he was this fascinating character. He was one of the first great musical stars in New York, in America. He was one of the first has-beens. He was living on the Bowery in a attic room where he either died accidentally or on purpose. He slit his throat. The newspaper said he fell in a washing bowl that cut his throat. Try that. That would be an Olympic achievement. So I never really went out and read. I never traveled on my. I looked at books. I got everything out of books. But this, I went down. The hotel is still there. You know where it is.
It's on the corner of, it's 30 Bayard and Bowery.
Right. And I mean, I didn't have like an out-of-body experience, but I said, I think I know who this guy was. And, you know, this building is still, and he was there. And I said, that's when I made the decision. I have to write fiction. I have to know what was in his head that night in the hotel room and how he wound up here and who he loved and all that stuff. It's like the best biography of Foster that you could write. You can't know. My theory was he was an outsider. He didn't fit in. He heard things other people did. So I said, it's a good chance he was gay because he's outside. So he sees things differently. People had problems with that. People, you know, it's funny writing novels. Tom Flanagan wrote a great book, Year of the French. He said, yeah, people are, fiction is still going to complain. He said, I wrote A Year of the French about the 1798 rebellion. He said, I got letters from Cornwallis's.
Foster lived at 30 Bowery, and I think we've talked about this. And my family, when they came here in the 1850s, early 1860s, lived at 25 Bowery, or literally across the street. And I've often wondered, and back then you have young children dying 6 months, a year, and one of my great-great-grandparents' child died at the age of 1. And I remember thinking when I heard the song Slumber My Darling, would her mother have sung that to her? Would they have known his songs back then? And it just makes me feel very connected to that time.
Yeah.
By the way, I just got a text from your son, Daniel. Andrew Cuomo has announced he's running for president, and he announced he wants Peter Quinn to manage the church.
Was that somebody who once said to somebody, I need a Peter Quinn? I said, well, tell him I died in the traffic accident. And the car and my body were incinerated.
Come on. All right, one more comment, and then we'll go to a Q&A.
Okay.
You took a shot at Tucker Carlson in the beginning of the book, and I thought a conservative Republican like you, how could you do that?
Yeah. Well, he's so repulsive. You know, he said Ocasio-Cortez actually has my father's congressional seat in the Bronx. And he talked about as a Bronx bartender, like that was something to be ashamed of. I said, he's so stupid, she bartended in Manhattan.
All right, what next? What next?
Oh, what next? Next is I'm working. I put the novel aside to write Cross Bronx, but you know, I'm 75. I never had a bestseller, and look, I don't think I'd get anything published at this point. But I'll just keep writing. It's a great way to spend the day. I never have been bored in my life between reading and writing. I never looked around and what's should I do. I always feel like I should be doing this. Why didn't I write that novel? There's this novel. Every day, the first thing I read are the obituaries. And I'm always like, this is a novel. Look at this person's life. It's the author and went to London and did this and went that. How could you not be fascinated? The human story is so fascinating. The individual story. And that's the province of the novel. So, and then I write, you know, stuff for Common and Will or American. But I'm never at a loss. So what's next? Get up, have a cup of coffee, read the Times, and then start.
Nothing wrong with that. So how about some questions? You want?
Yeah.
It's got a few answers.
Peter, thank you. And you too, Charles.
Thank you.
was wondering if you could, your father in the book comes across as a real enigma. You allude to the fact that his father in turn was a union organizer and sounds largely absent.
His father was, when he was president, he was very present. But he went all around the country organizing unions.
So he wasn't home a lot.
But, I was telling Charles at one point where they lived on 11th Street in 1905, there were 11 people in the apartment. So I said, it might not just be union organizing. He wanted to get out of the house. And he was an Irish immigrant. He was very tough. I tell a story in the book that this is a true story. He took my father and his brother to Coney Island, teach him to swim, and he threw my father off the dock. And that was his lessons were always that, you had to be strong, you had to stand up, and the weak get crushed unless you stood up. And he had like Popeye arms, he was short. My father was very light, thin, and wanted to be a songwriter. It was not, talking about culture gaps. He grew up in post-famine Ireland. My father was growing up on the Lower East Side in New York. Now my kids grew up in Hastings, the suburbs, so I said, they're the first Americans in the family, right? They go to parochial school, they're not wedded to the neighborhood, it's not just Italian, Jewish, Irish. They don't have that same sense of identity, which again that's fine, that's what life is, it moves on. You can hold on to it to yourself, but don't try to hold your children to it, that's my feeling.
Maureen?
Peter, how did your brother feel about the book, or how does he feel, or did he have contrasting thoughts about it or experiences?
I'm a twin, not identical twin. And my brother and I have been incredibly close all our lives. And he lives around the corner from Kathy and myself. His wife is a very good friend. Our kids were raised together. So we've always been on the same wavelength. I write things, I give it to him. He's a writer too. He worked for the Daily News, Esquire, he ran Robert Kennedy's magazine, Waterkeepers, for 17 years, and he was the head writer at the Ford Foundation. Which, I tell this anecdote in the book. People say, well, it's genetic, right? I said, I don't believe writing is genetic. But my father used to have a dictionary. He was a great fan of a big dictionary on a podium, and he had a ladder steps. So if you asked him what something meant, he'd say, look it up. So it was almost like mounting the altar to the gospel. And that's the kind of feeling we both had about writing. There's nothing more important you can do. And I came to this conclusion when I was writing at Time Warner. Storytellers are always regarded as a secondary profession, a serious profession, but it's the most elemental human job. That's what made us human, sitting around telling stories. And most of us sit watching television and listening. We all want to hear stories. It's the human desire to be told stories. And every religion, every nation, every family is organized a story. They all have the English story, the Irish story, the American story, and that helps define what people are, their stories. Absolutely. So it's not a secondary profession, it is the elemental profession. Yeah.
Thank you, Peter and Charles. Quick question for you, Peter, about the Bronx. So I mentioned in
the Bronx.
I mentioned in my opening remarks, I first met you 30 years ago when I was more than 30 years ago when I was living in the city, and I was away then for a quarter of a century, and I came back a few years ago. People ask me, has it changed? And I say, yeah, it's unrecognizably different, but it's just the same, right? So the Bronx, it's in the little passage I read, it's a vanished world. But what's the same? What has remained in the Bronx?
The zoo.
Fordham.
The Bronx is so new. It didn't become a borough. It became part of New York City in 1898. Yeah. It became a borough in 1914. In 1920, it was the fastest growing county in the United States. So a large part of the housing was thrown up in the 20s. And when I came along in the
40s and 50s, it felt like it had always been like this. You know, you couldn't believe that it hadn't been covered with apartment buildings. I lived through the great change, the ethnic change from Jewish, Irish, Italian to Black and Puerto Rican. And the whole South Bronx changed, and it became, this happens all over the world. Rural people move into cities. They go into the oldest part of the city, which begins to decay. You know, we're not realizing the theoretical basis of that in the 60s and 70s, but I watched it happen. I was a court officer. I could see, you know, the place is changing incredibly. I guess that I don't know what it'll be in the next 50 years. Who knows? They built a railroad station in the Bronx, still there. And they said this will be the Grand Central Station in 1950 because the city's moving north, right? Didn't never get in the business of predicting the future. You're going to look like an idiot. Shall we call it a night?
I'll read one thing and we'll call it a night. This is one thing.
I forgot I had this.
Do I need it?
Yes.
No? Yes? Okay.
Toward the end of the book, you wrote, a memoir isn't a rearview mirror. It's a scrim on which a melange of images is projected, some clear, some blurred, some amusing, others painful, an unfolding of revelations. Who wrote this, Dan Barry? Indictments, vindications, a confrontation with all I've done and failed to do. Looking back, what I'm struck by most is luck. And I thought of English poet John Milton and later Branch Rickey, who signed Jackie Robinson. Luck is the residue of design. And I think you achieved that. Thank you.
Thank you, our panelists again, and thanks everybody for coming. We're not quite at the stage in Ireland House where we are back to our post-event receptions. The house has been refurbished. I heard a rumor that the Irish vision is to repair to the pub. There are plenty of those around. Swifts, I think, it's a public choice. So thank you again.
Thank you.